So I figured I'd talk about sword dynamics a little bit with you guys. You see a lot of people talk about weight and balance. And weight and balance can tell you something about what a sword feels like, but not everything. If you figure that, your point of balance is somewhere around here, well, the first thing it's not going to tell you is where the vibrational nodes are, nor is it going to tell you where the mass is distributed. So, assuming the sword weighs the same, you can either have a concentration of mass in the middle here, or it can be pulled out like this. Or you can have a apparent mass very much at the ends. Think a dumbbell kind of feel. And each of those will balance in the same place, but feel very, very different. How you control this as a sword maker is through thinning the distal taper in the sword, usually about here to here, or changing the weight of the pommel and guard, mostly the pommel. The farther from the balance point you work, the more effect smaller amounts of weight have on the balance and also on the physics of the sword. The vibrational nodes of a sword there's two we need to worry about. The first one is the forward node, which is always around 70% of the length of the sword. So somewhere in here. You can usually move it around by like 5%. The one that we really can move around is the secondary node. And that one, we want to put that somewhere in the palm of the hand here. If it's a two-handed sword, either in the first palm or usually right around that junction there. And the reason is that when you strike something with an off blow and you don't catch that node, that harmonic will go down the blade. And if this is not lined up properly, it'll try to jump out of your hand and it'll feel very off. The farther out the actual feeling of mass is from this point, the more the sword will tend to bounce. So if you have a lot of weight at the pommel and a lot of weight at the tip and a very long sword, what tends to happen is what we call the snake dance, where it tends to vibrate and it tries to jump out of your hand. If you make the sword properly, with just enough weight to balance and set the pivot points up and nodes up, the sword will hit something, vibrate for a second, and dampen itself out and not try to jump out of your hand. So now I'm going to go through this sword here. I have two swords on the bench here, and I'm going to show you how to track those various points. The other 2 points that we need to track are what we call pivot points. There's an aft pivot point and a forward pivot point based on here and here. So the forward pivot point is usually between the tip of the sword and maybe a little bit in front of the vibrational node. So we'll call that forward pivot. The aft pivot point is usually between here and here. And we can move these around by taking weight off of here or adding or removing weight here. And I like to, when a sword that's going to be used for chopping, I like to bracket the harmonic line. That way it kind of wants to bite and it seems to give the sword more power. For swords that are primarily thrusting, I try to push these out so that the rotation is around the point of the sword. So we'll take a look at these two blades I have here as examples, and we'll go through it. So this is a sword I'm working on. This came from the class I taught in Maine last year. I haven't had a chance to finish out, but I figured I would use this as a good example to determine where the different nodes are. So the first thing I'll do is just look for the harmonic node, which for that I'm going to smack the pommel like this and look for the spot on the sword that's not vibrating, which it's a little hard to see, but I'm going to guess it's right about here. We'll mark that out in purple, which is V for vibration. V for vibration. So that's the first thing there, the vibration node. And like I said, this will move around a little bit, but not much. Currently, this has a 7.2 ounce pommel on it. Now, if I change this pommel out for one that's heavier, we'll get different results. So first, let's see where we are. I'm going to move the sword this way and look for that spot that is pivoting around. No, that's not right. About here. So this is forward pivot, about right there. So that's not really where I want that yet. Aft pivot. So right now they're essentially together. So clearly that's not what I want to do. I want to push this out and push this back if I can. So let's do that by adding some weight to the pommel. This one is 8 ounces. So it's only, 0.8 ounce, or a little bit over half an ounce more. Now let's see what that does to shift things. That's pushing that down about here. We'll do this one in orange. And that one moved back a little bit. So you see I've started to spread those. There. And the vibrational is about there still. It's actually pulled back slightly. So you see now I've started to bracket this, but I need a little bit more weight. So this is 9.6, like that. Now let's see what that does to this, shall we? Oh, let's push that quite a bit down. Here. Ooh, I need another color. So you can see my aft pivot as I add weight is going that way, and my forward pivot is going forward. And the vibrational node is moving back slightly. Again. There we go. So you can see now, this is shifted backward a little, that is shifted forward, and this is shifted back, just by adding weight to that pommel. So now I've gone back to the original pommel with 7.2 ounce, and I've had this falling on the floor. I've had this little bit of clay, which is about a half an ounce, a little over, on the tip. Let's do the same measurement with this, again, taking a half an ounce off the tip. So now, right here, we'll do green. Forward pivot. Half pivot. And we'll do the vibration. Now we see the vibration notice here, it is bracketed by those two. By taking less than an ounce off the tip of the sword, I've affected it far more than adding 2 ounces to the pommel and made the whole sword lighter. So generally when I'm trying to tune a sword blade, the first thing I look at is whether the sword's blade is stiff enough that I can still remove some material and get this thinned out. If I can thin this out, especially far out near the tip, that'll make the sword more active without adding weight. In fact, it makes it lighter. And lighter swords are faster and wear you out less. So just by reducing a small amount of material here, I can reduce the pommel size by a huge amount. So smiths of the medieval era definitely had a bigger grasp of this than we give them credit for, and they had a lot of sneaky little tricks to adjust how the sword felt while keeping the profile the same. A lot of that is actually just changing the cross section. Doing things like, instead of doing a diamond like this, they would do what's called a lenticular cross section. So they would cut off this top here. So they would do whoop, whoop, like this. Now the thing with a lenticular cross section is that's actually just as stiff because it has the same amount of surface area. Well, not quite as stiff, but it's close to as stiff as this, because it has a lot of surface area, which is what creates stiffness. But it is also significantly lighter because you've removed all this material. Other methods of getting rid of weight are to do a hollow grind, like this. Or the medieval favorite, to do an octagonal cross section. Or hexagonal cross section, sorry. Like this. And then they can mess with thickness quite a bit, because this can be down, you know, under a 1/16 out here, and kind of almost gone into this lozenge shape far out here, while maintaining a very crisp cross section through most of the sword blade. And as long as you have the appearance of crispness, it doesn't even look different. So you can just kind of come in with a file and just crisp a little section right here, like this, and make that look crisp, even if the rest of this is all washed out. So you can actually like reinforce that shape by sculpting it in rather than actually having it. It's something you see on quite a bit of medieval swords. The other thing from graphs I've seen of distal tapers is they're very careful in how they distribute the mass in the sword. If you take measurements every inch or so of the sword and then graph it against the length, it doesn't do this. It's not a linear taper. What it generally is something like this. It drops out like that. And you can see this becomes purposeful for two reasons. The first one is they're trying to take weight out of the tip, and then they're also trying to keep stiffness in certain areas of the sword. Because when you're flexing the sword, you want to see it bend in a nice even arc without really bending near the hilt. So you want a little straight section like that, so it's distributing force over the whole length of the sword. And you can get that by doing this. You know, and it's not actually jumping down like that. In reality, it's probably quickly dropping down from 1/4 inch to 3/16, and then it's staying at roughly 3/16 down to eighth, and then it drops quickly down to 1/8 of an inch, and it stays at 1/8 of an inch, and then drops to a 1/16. And the swords that I've managed to get a hold of and measure all do that. You know, the last 8 inches of the sword is generally a straight line, changing less than a millimeter, whereas there's drastic changes all along the blade. And I can't help but think that those are intentional, because if they weren't, it'd be actually easier to get a linear taper. You'd almost have to do it the other way. And then they also did things like put fullers in the blade. That helps change where the apparent mass is. You can do changes in width as well. So if you change the tip from a very long pokey tip, but you want to pull something back, you can sweep it in like this, and all of a sudden, by losing that extra inch or so, you gain a little bit of weight toward that tip, and you can adjust from there. There's lots of sneaky things that they did that way. The hilt actually tends to have less effort on the rest of the sword. It is important. You want this kind of to be as light as possible, because everything sort of fulcrums around this. And if the hilt is too heavy, it makes the whole sword feel sluggish. If you have a light hilt with it's just enough weight to protect the hand and make the form silhouette, it tends to make the sword just feel a lot lighter. And even if it's the same weight. It's a very odd thing with swords, that a sword that's 2 pounds 10 ounces and proportioned properly feels way lighter than one that's 2 pounds 10 ounces and proportioned completely wrong. So what these actually mean in reality is that there'll be a spot that the sword bites deeper just by its very nature. So you can see here it just sort of bounces, catches, and then it'll start to bounce again. And then there'll be a secondary spot and then bounce. And it's usually right around that vibrational note. But when I have these two bracketed, the amount of bite is even deeper.